hope everyone is enjoying the beautiful spring weather. This is true. This is true. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you miss the snow or you miss the cold weather, just wait a day or two. You'll be fine. Yeah, don't worry about tomorrow, right? All right. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll jump in this morning to the Word. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to be here again this morning. Thank you for the health. Thank you for the blessings that you've given to us, Lord, starting with salvation, starting with a relationship with you. And Lord, would we never take that for granted? Father, help us to desire to strengthen that relationship with you on a daily basis, not just on Sundays. Lord, give us wisdom now as we look into this account this morning. I pray that it would be an encouragement and a challenge to us as we seek to grow that relationship. We just want to thank you for this time in your name. Amen. All right. I feel like I just need to take a deep breath. Maybe it's just me today. I don't know. All right, so if you've got notes this morning, then you've already seen where we're heading. I don't know how common of an account this is with Jonathan and his armor bearer. I'm sure we're familiar with it. I actually learned several new things in my studies this week in my preparation for this. Some of it out of curiosity, and some of it just, well, I'll just be honest and say I was ignorant. I didn't know. And so I learned some really cool things that hopefully, I think a teacher's goal is always to have something that their students don't know. So hopefully you won't know some of this, and it'll be new and enlightening to you. But for me, it was really cool. I've been through this account, and I've been through 1 Samuel, but I never really paid attention to some of the details in this. So we're going to talk about some of those and draw some conclusions from them this morning. I feel like it goes better if somebody else is willing to read the 1 through 14. This isn't the whole story. We're not going to read the whole thing this morning, but is somebody willing to read those 14 verses for us? I will. Thank you, Pam. No, you're good. While Pam's getting there, just a little background, because we always like to know where we're heading and where we came from. This is a really dark time in Israel. King Saul has been king for probably a couple years at this point. The Philistines, those pesky Philistines, are constantly at Israel. And this is one of those instances where it's overwhelming odds. In fact, in chapter 13, we actually see that the Philistines have oppressed so much that it says that there weren't even blacksmiths in Israel. So they had gotten rid of all the blacksmiths because they didn't want the Hebrew people to make spears and swords. So they made them come to the Philistines in order to sharpen their tools, their farming tools and such. And I don't know what prices would be. I tried to look it up, and nobody seemed to have a really good answer. But chapter 13:21 tells us that they charged 2/3 of a shekel for plowshares and for mattocks, and 1/3 of a shekel for sharpening the axe and for setting goads. Now, I could say that really dramatically and maybe make it sound really expensive. I have no idea how much it is, but I'm guessing if the Philistines are oppressing Israel, it's not cheap. This is crazy prices. This is inflation. We know that word. So this is kind of the time period that we're in. The Philistines have started to invade, I guess you can say, again, raid Israel. King Saul has taken 600 men with him. Everybody else is afraid or elsewhere. And he is now waiting, in chapter 13, he's waiting for Samuel to arrive to make a sacrifice before they go into battle. And if you remember one of Saul's big downfalls was that he became impatient, whether it was out of fear or just plain impatience. He made the sacrifice before Samuel showed up. And that was part of the beginning of the end of King Saul and his reign. And so this is all happening right before our account this morning. So life in Israel is chaos. It's scary. People are hiding. In fact, if you read through there, you find out people are hiding in caves and hiding out in the middle of nowhere. People are scared. Philistines are powerful, and they're threatening. And then it tells us that there was a garrison in verse 23 of chapter 13, right before our account. It says the garrison of the Philistines went out to the pass of, I'm going to say, Mishmash. That place is a really good place for a garrison. We'll find out. So Pam, if you'd read the 1 through 14.
One day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man bearing his armor, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah, under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was son of Ichabod's brother. I don't know if that's Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistine outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez, and the other Seneh. One cliff stood to the north, toward Michmash, the other to the south, toward Geba. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of these uncircumcised fellows. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all that you have in mind," his armor-bearer said. "Go ahead. I'm with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come then. We will cross over toward the men and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up to us, and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up, using his hands and feet, with his armor-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armor-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre.
All right. So there's our account, and there's our unnamed person, Jonathan's sword bearer, his armor bearer. So first of all, you can see in what we know about this guy from the Bible, the first and most obvious thing is he was Jonathan's armor bearer. So that begged the question, what's an armor bearer?
That was my
Good. And this is where I learned something brand new. I've always glazed over this and was like, oh, good, Jonathan had an armor bearer. They went together to fight the garrison.
Armor is heavy.
Armor is heavy.
You can't go all the way carrying.
Well, there's that, and there's actually more that I was very shocked at, to be honest. And I'm going to try and keep it acceptable for our company this morning. Because really what we have here is we have a trusted servant. This is somebody that the master, usually a king, a prince, a main soldier, had, who followed him into battle. He was with him all the time. It wasn't just in the actual combat. He was with him. He assisted him in putting on his armor because it was heavy. It was a lot of work. Had a lot of things to tighten. He would help make sure and maintain all the weapons that the soldier had. he would carry, often when they're heading into battle, before the actual combat begins, he would carry his shield, and frequently he would carry what we would consider to be backup weapons for the soldier. Here's the place that caught me off guard, because if you look back where Pam read, it says that Jonathan went up and they fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. That threw me a little bit. I was like, I've never noticed that. I always pictured, and if you had a Sunday school teacher like me, I always was taught that Jonathan and his armor bearer went up side by side and they fought together, and maybe each of them knocked off 10 or something. But in reality, in this case, and traditionally armor bearers would not walk in, they would come into the battle behind their guy that they're following. And the main soldier, in this case Jonathan, would go in and combat and fight everybody, and maybe severely wound somebody, maybe knock them to the ground, knock them out. And as he's leaving this path of destruction behind him, the armor bearer is going through and finishing the job for him. So the soldier was frequently the primary conflict guy. In this case, Jonathan was most likely took on all 20 or however many he killed initially on his own. And as he had wounded, they fell to the side. His armor bearer came up and just followed, and we'll just say cleaned house. He made sure that they weren't going to come up behind him at the end. How's that? So that was kind of an interesting concept for me, because, like I said, I always thought it was just a buddy of Jonathan, and he went up and fought with him, which he did. He just didn't do it in the way that I thought he did. So Jonathan, his armor bearer, was with him in the battle, but he was assisting him. I often think of the account of David and Goliath, because Goliath had an armor bearer, and I often wondered what he did. It makes so much more sense now that he had an armor bearer holding his shield and at that point it was his weaver's beam spear that he had, and carried it for him while he had his other weapons and he was getting ready for combat and such. And it's just very interesting. I gave you the short version, let's just put it that way. So he was Jonathan's armor bearer. We do know that he was faithful to Jonathan, because an armor bearer had to be fully devoted to the person he was carrying, or he was following, because kings had armor bearers. The last thing a king needed was somebody untrustworthy and unfaithful to him, who would be watching his back during a battle. You can imagine how easy it would be to have a new king the next day. And so this person, and in this case Jonathan's armor bearer, had to be faithful to Jonathan, the prince, really, at this point. Then the third thing there, we find in verse 13, he stayed with Jonathan through the whole attack and assisted him. And I already read that verse about him coming up behind Jonathan in this battle. So there's not a lot of other information specifically from this that we can take away, but because of some of the interactions between him and Jonathan, we can learn and we can glean some things through the next section there about what I call, what can we speculate about him. So let's just jump in those, and then we're going to get to some questions and discussion here in a minute. But I kind of want to get our brains thinking, because this is not a classic Bible story that we hear and we grew up with on a regular basis. We have to kind of get a feel for it. So here's the first one, speculation-wise. It must have been such an encouragement to Jonathan to have such a faithful encouragement. And I think I miswrote that. I think it's better in yours, isn't it? Have a faithful servant? Okay. I don't know why I forgot to change it here. Obviously it was his job. It makes sense. But there is an element where having this faithful servant who Jonathan knew had his back in battle had to be an encouragement, had to be a help to Jonathan in facing odds, not just here, but in other battles as well. In this particular situation, we actually see, instead of just saying, okay, let's go, I'll follow you, his armor bearer actually interacts with him a little bit, starting in verse 7. Look what it says there. It says, his armor bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart, do as you wish. Okay? This is after Jonathan said, I got a crazy idea. And we're going to find out how crazy it actually was here in a minute. But his armor bearer heard his faith in God. You know, Jonathan's saying, hey, let's go up to that place. It may be that God's going to give him to us. We're going to be able to take him out, basically. And his armor bearer heard this and said, hey, whatever's in your heart and your mind, do it. But he didn't stop there. If you look at the end of verse 7, he finishes the statement by saying, I am with you heart and soul. What did yours say, Pam? Did yours say heart and soul in yours?
Yeah.
Okay, does anybody else have a different version that may say something different? I'm just curious. Yeah, right at the end of verse 7.
And you don't understand it, his armor bearer said to him, do all that is in your heart, turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire.
Okay. So, yeah.
It says, I'm with you completely.
I'm with you completely. Good. Anything else? Any other ones? I'm just curious.
Do as you wish.
Do as you wish. I have whatever you desire. There was a version that said, I am completely with you. I think we can sum it up in a modern phrase that you hear frequently, especially in the athletic circles, all in. His armor bearer, who was most likely a paid position, a paid servant, who didn't have to respond, he didn't have to interact because he was in a position where he had to obey, period. But instead of just obeying, what did he do? He encouraged him. Exactly. He encouraged him. He told Jonathan, hey, do what you know, really, modern language, do what you think is best. Because I'm all in. I'm with you all the way, regardless of what it is. And if you look at the second speculation, speaking of our armor bearer, he must have seen the craziness of attacking in overwhelming odds. Okay, think about this. If you heard Pam's description of their trip to the garrison, they had to go between two basically cliffs. I think yours said cliff. Yeah, the ESV says crag, and I have to be honest, and I had to look it up because I was like, what's a crag? Now I know. See, you learned all kinds of things. So they had to basically go between two cliffs. They're talking about an army who is superiorly armed better than Israel. How's that? Because if you actually look down earlier on in chapter 13, you find out that there were no swords in Israel, except King Saul and Jonathan both had one. Everybody else didn't. So any fighting had to be done with any kind of utensils or tools that they had. Okay? So now you know a little bit more why Israel's so afraid at this point. So they're outnumbered, they're well-trained soldiers, they're well-armed soldiers. They're in a garrison that's in a small area. Again, that acre, the description of an acre for the size, it's not necessarily the acre that we have today. It's not the same measurement. There's all kinds of speculations, anything from half a football field size-wise to smaller. All the conclusions that I got from the size of the garrison and the area that they fought was basically, it was tight quarters. If it was only 20-1 or 20-2, however you want to look at it, it was tight quarters. So our armor bearer had to have seen this. He was taking the walk with Jonathan. He was climbing up the side. In fact, how did they get up to the garrison to attack it? It was very specific. It said on his hands and feet. You know, if you've ever climbed a steep hill or a steep cliff, you're either down to your knees crawling, or you're doing the whole monkey thing where you're walking on your hands and you're walking on your feet to climb it because it's so steep. So this is what Jonathan and his armor bearer are experiencing, yet his armor bearer sticks faithfully with him.
Talk about being vulnerable.
Exactly, yeah. Which is absolutely an incredible concept. I would have thought, you know, in my mind, if I'm crazy enough to try this, I would have thought, okay, if they say, wait for us, we're coming down, oh, that's of the Lord, yeah, we're going to win. If they say, come up, I'm not climbing up there, no way. Jonathan had it completely opposite, which tells you how much faith he had in God, because he was confident that if God said go, he would win, and he would go. The third thing there, he chose to stick with Jonathan through it, though it didn't make human sense. There was nothing about what Jonathan chose to do with this garrison that was humanly sane. Okay, 1 man against 20. Now, we hear of accounts of David's mighty men later on who slew hundreds, thousands on their own. You know, God allows people to do that. And obviously God allowed Jonathan to get this victory as well. But from a human standpoint, very rarely would anybody say, oh, 20-1? Piece of cake, I'm going. So humanly speaking, the armor bearer probably should have been like, okay, Jonathan, let's talk this through. Let's think about this for a second. But that tells you the faithfulness, and really in my thinking, and I didn't put this on the speculation part, but in my thinking, it also showed the faith in God that the armor bearer had, in addition to Jonathan. Because why else would you look at him and say, hey, whatever's in your mind and your heart, do it. I'm with you all the way. Yeah.
Just kind of this application, when you were talking, it made me think of Jesus in John 15 saying, no greater love has man than to lay down his life for his friend.
Right.
The relationship between the armor bearer and Jonathan had a very close relationship. You may have just said, I admire you, I respect you, I committed to you as a friend, as a leader.
Right.
And ready to lay down his life.
Yeah, and I guess the more I've looked into the armor bearer concept back in these times, it had to have been more than just a servant-master relationship.
Yeah.
There had to have been a trust that was just phenomenal between the two of them.
Keep punching the clock on time.
Right. Oh, going to battle. Click. Yeah, this was, you know, he had a double whammy, because not only did he have to deal with whoever was left in the wake of the guy who was doing all the main fighting, he had to watch the back of his master, the guy he's following. And he was responsible for the safety, if you will, of that guy. So there had to be, that relationship. I like that reminder, that verse. There's no greater love than a friend that's willing to lay down their life. That's a...
I guess too, that if you have 20 guys, they're not all lining up in a row. They're probably trying to flank around.
You would think, unless they're just cocking, they're like, I'll try, and then if I don't get it, you get them. You know, I don't know, but regardless, 20-1 is not good odds.
I will blame you for this, Tim,
Uh-oh.
because now you put the question in my, with Goliath, I can't imagine the size of his armor bearer to carry his armor. And he
That dude.
wasn't anywhere to be found after David killed him.
That is an interesting concept. He disappeared. He did.
See, you made that question come up.
That is
I
a
never
really
thought about it
interesting,
until you just-
that's a really interesting concept. Yeah, his armor bearer disappeared. He was mentioned. The battle took place.
Maybe he was under glass when he fell over.
He was behind me. Oh no, here we go. I'm not catching you. Sorry, man. That's an interesting thought. Very interesting thought. But that also plays into what we're looking at today, the example of the faithfulness that this armor bearer had with Jonathan. Because guys like Goliath, the strongest, most intimidating soldier probably that the Philistines had ever seen, and yes, he was a Philistine, right? You know, he didn't have much of a trustworthy armor bearer.
He had to be a big
Right.
boy. Sure he did.
You bet. Oh, yeah. All right, so this is where I want you guys to come in, not that you haven't already, but just to think through some of these thoughts as we go through and we talk about this. This account, we've only read through verse 14, and I'll mention a little bit here towards the end. But we mentioned that the armor bearer was a support and encouragement to Jonathan as he did what he believed God would have him do, which was attacking this garrison. How would it affect you if you had someone that faithful and encouraging along you as you served God? Okay, it would make us bold. Any other thoughts on that?
My thought is, did God speak to him ahead of time? Because the question of what the Philistines would say to him, whether he went or he stayed, something had to happen.
You know
There was
what?
a plan somewhere.
Yeah, because I love how verse 1 starts. You know, you see the garrison happening. You see the issue. Verse 22 in chapter 13 says, "So on the day of the battle, there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any people with Saul or Jonathan, but Saul and Jonathan, his son, had them." And then it talks about the garrison. And then verse 1 starts off like a story. One day, Jonathan, there had to have been some kind of a asking God, is this of you, or is this just me wanting to be heroic? What is this? There had to have been that kind of at least a momentary, I don't know, humanly speaking. Why did this pop in my head? I can't remember.
I think
But-
there's a responsibility in talking about all of that we had with the people that we serve within church, the people that we're family within church, is to have a right relationship with God. Because if Jonathan didn't, if he's like going on a limb and just doing his thing, he's responsible for the life of his armor bearer.
Yeah.
And just like we're responsible for the lives of people around us, to make sure that we understand the word and make sure that we're following it in the way that God intended it.
Yeah. Yeah, I always, not that when you serve at church, you're either the soldier or the armor bearer, but really just kind of an analogy popped into my head is that when we're serving in church, we should always be looking to encourage who we're serving with. It should always be something in our minds and our hearts. How can I better encourage whoever it is to be faithful, to do it, to work at it, to get whatever done. But at the same time, it's always nice to have that person. So it all comes back to my relationship with God. Exactly. If I'm in the right relationship with God, I will look to be that encourager, but I will also be an example to those around me.
Well, as you were speaking, you kept
Ouch.
this together.
Hmm?
The
Yeah.
armor bearers,
We learned a long time ago, the church, our sending church for missions, when we were there was right around 600 people. It was a big church, biggest church I've ever been a part of in my entire life. And if you've never been in a church that size, it's really difficult to make close friends. But we discovered that it's the ones that we served with that we got the closest to. And I don't think it needs to be a big church to have that be true. I think this concept of being an encourager is kind of an indication of you and I serving in church. You get to know the people that you serve actively with. You get to know the people that you are shoulder to shoulder with in the trenches, if you will. And those are the people that we can be encouraging to. Interesting concepts. I like it. What do the following verses tell us about being faithful and encouraging? Now, we could have probably done a search, and if you've ever done a search for a specific verse online, you have those websites that they're like 76 verses about God's faithfulness. And you get about 5 of them down, and they just kind of go everywhere. You're like, what? Where'd this come from? Anyway, so we could do that. We could do searches about our call to be faithful and encouraging, and there's a ton of verses out there. But what I'd like to do is I just picked 3 out today that kind of give us a balanced view of how we can be encouraging and faithful to one another. So there's 3 verses here. So can I get 3 volunteers to read? All right, if you'll get the Proverbs 27, okay? Hebrews 10, 24, and 25. I always feel like an auctioneer on these moments. All right, thank you, Terry. What's that? Going once? Going twice? How about 1 Thessalonians 5:14? All right, thank you. All right, so we'll read these one at a time. What I want you to listen for is, how does this challenge us? I'm not going to say encourage us to encourage others. That sounds weird. How does this challenge us as Christians, as fellow brothers and sisters in Christ, to be that faithful and encouraging person? So Proverbs 27.
Okay, Proverbs 27:17. Iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another.
How would that's kind of an ironic verse because we're talking about a battle. But how would that play into us being that encourager for someone else? Yeah.
I think it's that element that it's not just a feel-good thing. It's not just make them feel like, oh, happy. And, we really do come alongside each other and push each other to see life through God's eyes, grow, but also come alongside and be that scaffolding, that edifying that the New Testament talks about over and over again. Bolstering people up, helping.
Good.
Like, you can do that.
You think that challenge, right? I can't. Pushing each other back in the line.
That's how it works.
Okay, I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands or acknowledgement, but how many times in our Christian life have we needed a little bit of we'll just say shove, how's that? To do what we know is right. Yeah.
I don't think that's how we do on that. But sometimes you really have to push it from the other.
Yes, and we're using push and shove as a nice way to say what we all are thinking. But, yeah.
In the armed forces, there's competition.
Yeah.
But against the enemy, there is none. They're uniform.
It's true.
In unity.
Yeah, period.
I heard it said about that scripture that the iron sharpens iron. When you have iron, rubbing against iron sparks off. You're saying it's not always pleasant.
Yep.
It can be quite hot.
I say being an encourager and a faithful friend or faithful fellow servant of the Lord doesn't always have to be this pretty flowers and roses moment. Because there are times where, me included, I need to have somebody come along and say, wait a minute, what you're doing, how you're acting, what you're saying, not right. And yeah, sparks can fly.
You were talking about being an auctioneer. Perry is one if you need it.
Next time I need verses, I'll just have you get volunteers for me. All right, what about Hebrews 10, 24, and 25?
And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near.
All right, just want to point out a couple of concepts in this one. I just noticed our time, so we're running very short on time. But I love the phrase, stir up. You know, as soon as I heard that word, you know what my mind went back to? A little bit of sugar, a little bit of Kool-Aid powder, a little bit of water, big wooden spoon, stir it up, let's make Kool-Aid. That's from back, I don't even know if they make that powder anymore, but do they? Okay. You know, but really that's kind of the stir up one another into love and good works. Do we encourage each other to serve? You know, and then it talks about encouraging, and then all the more as we see the day drawing near. And we can just make a quick application of that and say, you know what? I don't know about you, but all I got to do is look out the doors, and life is getting worse and worse. This world is getting worse and worse. And we need to be more and more encouraging to one another, to stand up and be, like we talked about last week, that light, that salt to this world around us. 1 Thessalonians 5:14.
And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all.
All right, there's our 4 commands. Admonish, encourage, help, be patient. Is that how we interact with each other on a daily basis and a weekly basis? Interesting concepts there. We don't have time to develop all of those, but we have a good idea about admonishing, encouraging, help, be patient. All of those are things that ought to be in our lives. But all of this, and it was already mentioned, Pam already mentioned this concept, it's great for us to be that encourager, to be that iron that's sharpening another iron. But the key is our hearts. Where's our relationship with God? You know, my mind went back to that analogy of the log in my eye. How can I help a guy get a splinter out of his eye? I got this big old beam in my eye. You know, I need to be sure that I'm right with God and I'm being faithful before I can actually encourage and help someone else do the right thing. Then the lessons down at the bottom for you to ponder through. You know, Jonathan's armor bearer was faithful and supported him as he followed God. Who can we be that guy for? Who can we be that encourager for? And then the armor bearer was secondary and unnamed in this heroic story of Jonathan, yet he remained faithful. Being faithful encourager for others does not mean that you'll always be recognized. You know, you don't have to be on the front lines. We can just be that encourager that nobody sees and nobody knows about, because we're doing it for God's glory, not for mine. So, all right, let's have a word of prayer. Lord, thank you. Thank you for the example. Thank you for your amazing intervention, because you read on in the story in 1 Samuel, you find out that you miraculously conquered the Philistines without Israel having to do much of anything. And Lord, we thank you that you are still that same God today. Help us as we serve you to not only be faithful personally with my relationship with you and my faithfulness to you, but Lord, help us to be the encouragement and the faithful fellow soldier that Jonathan's armor bearer was for him. Thank you. Pray for the service to follow now, that you would be honored in it and it would all point to you, and that we would be challenged to go out and be that example that we need to be this week. In your name, amen.
You understand, we talk about reading stuff. ICR sent me, I read it